Good morning. Hey, on that note about the marathon, it's my mom's story to tell. Yeah, I ran a marathon, but she's 62 and ran a marathon. She experienced a miraculous healing as she ran. For months, her calf had been all balled up to the point that it was too painful to even jog because she tried week after week, going to different treatments, praying. She was up here every Sunday asking for prayer and healing. And this went on for about 2.5 months, and she became discouraged. Why hasn't God healed me? And that's understandable. So she still came, and we said, Mom, let's just go to the start line. Let's see. And even if you walk, you still get to participate and do something. So she tried jogging, and she said there was a lot of pain. But then like a mile into it, she felt this really intense pop in her calf. And she's like, slowly, I felt the pain move to the side, and then it was gone. She was able to run the next 25 miles and finish the race. It's amazing. And she told her doctors that, and they're like, yeah, medically, that's not a thing. That doesn't make sense. So you experienced a miracle. The same doctors, the chiropractor that she has been week after week inviting to come to church. So who knows, God is doing something there. But this morning, I look forward to sharing this time with you. 7 years ago, Mark and I were in the process of he was interviewing to become the lead pastor here. There was an opening, and this process went on for many months. And as he kept going through the rounds, we learned more about the church, the Bridge, and specifically something that was really unique to the Bridge, and that was that they had land, this land that you're sitting on right now. It was theirs, and they had plans to build a church. And why this was really interesting and caught our attention was because there wasn't a church yet in this part of South Chino. And we knew that this was a master planned community, the preserve that we're part of. And so it excited us. It felt like a really strategic opportunity to be able to reach all of these new families who'd be moving in. And so fast forward, Mark ends up getting the job, and we move out here. And one of the first meetings that we go to is with some of the leadership at that time, and we're in someone's back porch talking specifically about the building plans and what phase 1 would look like, how we're going to raise the rest of the money that was needed to start construction. And there was definitely excitement in the air. But there was also this notion that gave us a little bit of hesitation, and it was this. We kept hearing, well, if we build it, they will come. If we build this brand new, incredible building right in the middle of all these new homes in this growing area, we'll open the doors and God will fill it. And what gave us pause was it was almost like an equation. It felt a little bit too simplified. We do our part, and then obviously God's going to do his. So we proceed with raising money to be able to start phase 1 of construction, and construction begins, and these walls go up, and it's an amazing process to watch unfold, and we get excited, more and more excited as time goes on. And so we plan our grand opening ceremony, the day that we would open the doors to this community and get our name out there as a church. We set the date for March 29th, 2020. It was 5 years ago this weekend. And we hand out invites to every home that was built around that time, and we put it all over social media, and we advertise it because this is the moment, right? We've done our part, we've sacrificed, we've built, we've toiled. Now God's going to show up and do his. He's going to fill this place, right? Wrong. On March 29th, our grand opening never happened because just a few weeks earlier, we entered a global pandemic. And instead of gathering together on that day, all of us were scattered to our homes. We were isolated, sheltering in place. And for almost the entire next year, this building sat vacant. But during that time, God continued to move. Our church started to make some changes that we needed to our culture to grow healthier. We began hungering for a real move of God. We didn't get the transaction from God that we hoped for. Instead, we got the transformation from God that we needed. Last week, Mark walked us through Genesis 6-9. We looked at Noah and the flood, and we saw that God responds with justice to the evil and the chaos that humanity had created. The earth was so evil that it broke God's heart. So he responds with a flood. But even in that flood, his mercy shows. As Mark had that chart up, the recreation that God performed through the flood was a mirror of creation in Genesis 1. So he hadn't given up on humanity altogether. So Genesis chapter 10, which we're not going to cover, it's the genealogies of how God is repopulating the earth after the flood through Noah and his 3 sons. But really, Genesis 3 through 11, if you step back and look at that chunk of scripture as a whole, it's a story with one common theme of how humanity continually misses the mark. They go opposite, deviating from God's design for creation. And then what happens? Sin. Repeated falls again and again. This morning, we get to look at one more story within that. It's a famous story. You may have heard about this before, the Tower of Babel. But it's also a story about a brand new, expensive religious building that was constructed. One that the people thought would give them what they wanted. It really is an ancient tale of, if we build it, God will come. So pull out your Bibles if you have one. If you don't have one, please grab one of the free orange Bibles in the seats below in front of you. And we're going to be on page 7 in Genesis 11, starting in verse 1. I'll read it for you. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. And yes, that literally means what it says. There was only one language spoken over the earth at that time. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, which is just another word for the ancient city of Babylon, now modern-day Iraq. And they settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And so they used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. And then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." And so the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. And that is why it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. This was the origin point of multiple languages. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. When I hear about the Tower of Babel, I imagine it looks something like this picture. Sort of this tall, narrow fixture that is built up towards the sky like a cylinder, like almost like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And it gets built so tall that it stretches up to the heavens, and there's easy access for God. But for us to really understand the tower that's being constructed here in Genesis 11, we have to understand this word, ziggurat. Would you like to say that with me? Ziggurat. Ziggurat. This is an ancient ziggurat, and it reminds me a lot of the Spice Girls song. They'll tell us what they want, what they really, really want. They want a zig-a-zig-a-rat. So I'm glad there are some other millennials in the room with me. This is a model for what a ziggurat looked like, and this was more accurately what was being built in Genesis 11. So it was their version of a temple for the gods. And you'll see there's that small room up at the top, that peak of the building, and that was the bedroom, the quarters where the gods would dwell. Now here is a real-life picture of a ziggurat. This one stands today in Iraq, but you'll notice it's missing the top part. What's central to the ziggurat is that staircase. It's the focal point. It's right in the center. And that was done intentionally and by design, because that staircase was the means by which the gods would come down to receive the sacrifices and the worship of their people. So this is happening pretty much, in ancient Babylonia. And the Babylonians, they're pagans, and they thought the sole purpose for why people were created was to appease the gods in heaven. The gods were thought to be fickle and hard to please. They were unpredictable. And so the humans would do things like build them temples for them to dwell in. They would provide sacrifices for them to have food to eat. And they would go and worship these gods to stroke their egos. And then, if the gods were pleased with their sacrifices, they would come down and they would bless their city. They would bless their land. They would give them bountiful harvest. They would give them protection from their enemies, and they would be a flourishing city. Now, at its core, this was a transactional relationship. So we do our parts, the gods do theirs. And this was very common in the ancient world. In the words of theologian John Walton, he said, pampered deities made for flourishing cities. But is there anything wrong with wanting a flourishing and safe city? Or is there anything wrong with wanting to build something great that will have influence and impact and legacy in your land? No, of course not. That's not the issue here, though. The issue here is how they were going about that. It's an issue of motive. Let's look again back at verse 4. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that, here's their purpose, we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. It's really interesting here at the end of the verse, they fear being scattered over the earth. They fear the very thing that is going to happen to them. And so I think in the back of their mind, they're like, we want to avoid being scattered from here and leaving the comforts of home. So let's build something great right here. We all speak the same language. Everybody knows each other. We can make a great name for ourselves here. So let's start a project together. That way we can avoid being scattered and going out and doing something apart from one another. But is this what God called humanity to do? If we remember back to Genesis 1, as God's creating the world, he creates humans, and he gives them this instruction, Genesis 1:28. So God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. God explicitly tells humanity, go out and fill the earth. The first problem here with the Tower of Babel is that they are resisting God's command to fill the earth by spreading out and scattering. Instead, they're saying, let's build a holy huddle. Let's stay close together within the confines of our own comfort, and let's make a great name for ourselves here. Which brings us to the main problem. It's the motive. Let us make a name for ourselves. Let's build something great. Now, as I mentioned before, and you have to get this, this in and of itself, building a name, building something of influence and impact and legacy, that's not bad. Making that an idol is bad. Exploiting the name of God to do so is bad. But we get a clue that the real motivation for the people building the Tower of Babel, it's not to elevate God's name at the end of the day. It's to do it their own way because they are resisting God's command to fill the earth and spread out. They're going about it in the opposite way. John Walton says it best. The problem was not that they wanted to make a name for themselves. The problem was that they were exploiting a relationship with God to do so. And that is something with which we might be able to identify. Constructing sacred spaces should be motivated by wanting to make God's name great, not by wanting to make our name great. How many of our great endeavors are focused on our glory and success rather than God's? What we see on display here in Genesis 11 is a transactional relationship with God. They're not really trying to get closer by building that ziggurat with a stairway for God. They are trying to get from God. They're more focused on getting from God rather than getting God himself. These are the telltale signs of a transactional relationship with God. It can look like this. But God, Yahweh anyway, is not a transactional God. The other pagan gods and idols were. They were fickle, they had needs, and they demanded that the humans met them, and then they'd say, in return, we will bless your city. We'll do this for you. We'll sacrifice for you. In return, come and do this for our city. But how many times have maybe we said things along the same lines to God today? It could look like this. God, if I give money to the church today, will you give it to me? Will you bless me in return? God, if I fast for one day this week to get that big promotion I want at work, will you give it to me in return? God, if I come to church on the Sunday before my big doctor's appointment, will you give me a clear report in return? God, if I pray for this big thing, will you cause it to go my way in return? I've had people kind of innocently confess that to me when they ask for prayer about something. They say, I feel like I'm only asking for prayer every time I need something. I've caught myself doing that in seasons of life where I'm like, man, God, I'm sorry. I've only been going to you when I need something. If you're feeling that way, that can be a small indicator, like the check engine light's on, that your relationship with God may be leaning more transactional than relational. Now, to be clear, we should be giving, and we should be fasting, and we should be praying, and we should be coming to church. So I'm not saying don't do those things, but only you know the motivation for why you do those things. You don't walk into here on a Sunday morning with your motivation written in a Sharpie on your name tag. I'm here because I got this going on this week. I'm serving because I've got this going on this week, and I'm trying to appease God. But that's a heart check. Are you more focused on trying to get from God or to get God? We've probably all been, at some point in our lives, on one side of a transactional relationship with a friend, with someone at work, with someone you're dating, where you felt like, man, it seems like they just want something from me more than they want to just spend time with me. They're trying to network off me. They're trying to get something from me. And that's a horrible feeling, isn't it? If we don't like feeling that way, being on the receiving end of a transactional relationship, God doesn't want to feel that way either. And so God responds to what's going on here in verse 5. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Which is pretty interesting. God's acknowledging, hey, if I don't step in, they will get what they want, what they really, really want. So God interferes. He says, come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. And so the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So God does come down, just as they had hoped, and God addresses their motives. Building something based on a transactional relationship to God, to get from him rather than to get him, to build a great name apart from God's way of building something great. See, making a name for yourself and spending your life doing that, God knows that that's only going to bring disorder. And so God gives them disorder. He confuses their language. So for the first time, all they hear is babbling, which must have been so interesting. They had never heard a foreign tongue before until now. Because if they can understand each other, they can't continue working on this group project together. They can't continue living in harmony together. They have no relationships left with one another. They are forced to scatter from here over the whole earth. Which really has to make us ask the question, the next time you feel your spouse is just babbling on and you don't understand a thing they're trying to tell you to do, perhaps it's God's judgment coming close. That was a joke. Even in his judgment here, God is still merciful. Just like we saw last week with the flood. We're so familiar with Noah and the flood story, but do you step back and realize, that was out of God's mercy that he chose to leave Noah and his family, that he chose to leave some of the livestock. He could have just been like, man, you guys have blown it so badly. I am going to start from a completely clean slate. I'm going to wipe this whole earth and every living thing in it. And I'm not even going to spare Noah and his family. as an act of God's mercy. Even here, God uses his judgment to send confusion on their language to help get his creation project back on track. Because he's like, you guys aren't scattering and filling the earth like I told you to do, because that was going to be best for you in Genesis 1:28. So I'm going to use this judgment to do what you have been refusing to do, to scatter you. I'm still going to be merciful and help get this creation project back on track. And that's what happens. They begin to scatter. They begin to fill the earth, just as they were told from the very beginning. The question this text raises for us today is, what's your motive for the life you're building? None of us are building ziggurats today. Well, maybe you are, and I would love to come see it if you are. But we're building something with our lives. All of us are. Even if you're in a season where you're like, well, I'm a stay-at-home parent, or I'm retired, or I'm too young to have it's not tied to vocation. We are all building something with our lives. The question we have to ask ourselves is what's the motivation? What's the fuel behind what you're building? Is it ultimately to make your name great or to make God's name great? Now, we have to realize that the culture we're surrounded by, the water that we swim in, shouts very loudly to us, but also it's so subtle that we don't even realize it because it's what we've grown up in. We're in a culture that says, make your name great. Look at the people that we glorify and admire. People with great names, celebrities, politicians, musicians, athletes, people who have made their name great. So, a lot of us may think this is just the American dream. This is what greatness and the good life looks like, is building success and wealth and fame so that people know your name. It's about motivation. Is your end goal in life to make your name great or God's? And here's how this can trickle out in your everyday actions is it's through your work, yes, but it's also through your generosity. It's how you spend your money. It's what kind of tip you leave when you're out at a restaurant. It's the way that you speak to others, especially those who frustrate you. It's the type of words that you use. It's your generosity with your time. It's the fruit of the Spirit oozing out of your life. That is how we help God's name be made great. Or maybe, if you're honest, your end goal is you want to be known as a successful and important person. I mean, if I'm honest, I spent the first half of my 20s doing that. I wasn't really following Jesus, and I just thought, okay, I'm out of college. It's time for me to chase the American dream and to build a great name for myself and to build a platform and to get my name out there. I was dead set on being a TV reporter. That's what I went to school for. And I devised a plan. I'm going to build my name to get out to the TV stations through competing at Miss America, as I had already been doing that to pay for school and get scholarship money. And so I thought, if I can get that exposure for my name on a national stage, then surely I can get my name out there to any station. I can get any type of job that I want. And then I can climb my way through the markets until I'm a well-known reporter who's making lots of money and has great impact and influence. That is what success is, right? Sure, I had some good motives mixed in there, like I wanted to use media for good and still be a blessing to people. But if I was honest, I thought the only way to a good, fulfilling life was to build my own name. I didn't know that there was another option. The crazy thing is that God let me get what I wanted, at least initially. I won Miss Oregon in 2012, and I was one of 52 women who would be competing for Miss America that year. I had done interviews with all the major TV stations in the Portland market, exchanged numbers with the news directors, and it was all falling into place, brick by brick. until one day it started to fall apart. God used a reporter, the very thing I was striving to become, to run an awful story on me, saying that I was this California girl who moved up and hijacked the crown from a local homegrown Oregon girl. But I'm not even from California, I'm from Indiana. But it turned into this whole dispute. A bigger story came out of it, of how residency was to be determined to even qualify to compete for Miss America, and attorneys got involved, and it became this big thing, and they ended up not ruling in my favor, and they said, you actually should have lived here a few months earlier to qualify, to even compete to be Miss Oregon. So I had to hand back my crown. My name that I was trying to build was completely smeared. I mean, the press was awful. Thankfully, God gave me a new name, and you can't find any of that stuff unless you know my maiden name. My dreams of being a reporter were shattered by a reporter herself. And a few months later, I sat in a small one-bedroom apartment up in LA with my mom and my sister, and I watched the first runner-up to Miss Oregon compete for Miss America in my place. God didn't have to stop me. God didn't have to interfere. He could have let me continue on that path and become a successful reporter, and I'm sure I could have done good with it. But it was out of his mercy that he interfered, and he said, no, Rachel, if you build with me and if you build for me, it can be even better. And at the time, I just thought, God, I'm sorry, but there's no way that anything else you're offering me can be better than what I just tasted. I mean, I got my name out there. I got on a stage. It was trending in the right direction. How could living this quiet, humble life, I'm waiting tables now. I'm sharing a one-bedroom apartment. I don't know what I'm going to do with my career because what I thought I was doing, it just got ripped out from underneath me. God, how could this be better than that? About a year into living that quiet, very humbled life, I sensed God saying to me one day, Rachel, I still want you to be a reporter. I just want you to tell my news. That sparked a curiosity in me. I said, what does that mean, God? I'd become serious about following Jesus in that year because honestly, everything else in my world had shaken. My parents had gotten divorced. I had nothing else to cling to. And so I was so desperate to find something that wouldn't be shaken by the circumstances of life. And so I went to my small group that week. I sat next to my friend Chelsea, and she happens to tell me about what she's learning at a class she's taking in seminary, at Fuller Seminary. And I found what she was saying to be so interesting. It sparked something in me. I was like, what, you get to learn that about the Bible? That sounds so cool. I don't really know much about the Bible. I kept thinking about that. I kept asking her more questions. And then I was like, you know what? I'm just going to see how much it costs to take a class at Fuller. So I took a class, and I loved it. And so I took another. And then I ended up enrolling as a full-time student in their master's program for theology. Because I thought, if this is from God, I want to prepare to build a life that tells his news. A year into being in seminary, I happened to sit next to a guy in class. His name was Lohman. And that would be the start of us partnering together with God to build something to make God's name known together. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't be standing here today doing this if God hadn't interfered with my self-motivated plans to make my own name great when I was 24. And maybe some of you are in that right now, or you feel like there's been an interruption to the life that you thought you were setting out to lead, and you don't understand it right now, and it's confusing, and you feel betrayed or disappointed by God. Maybe he's using it. Maybe he's using it to set your feet on the path to the life that is truly life. Sure, I mean, I could have gone the other way. I could have built my name, and I'm sure I would have had more money and a nicer car and a bigger house if I had gone that path. But you know what? I know without a shadow of a doubt that my life would have been emptier Because a life that sets out to build your own name, nothing's ever enough. No followers are ever enough. No promotions are ever enough. No fame, no glory, it's never enough. I would have missed out on the life that is truly life, that comes from building with God and for God. What's your motivation to the life you're building today? Here are a few questions to kind of gut check your motive. And maybe applying these daily will help. Now, you can't take them 100% literally, but you'll see. Ask yourself, by doing this action, will others be more likely to worship God or to worship me? By making this decision, will others be more likely to worship God or to worship me? And here's really the one for our generation. By posting this, will others be more likely to worship God or to worship me? It's really asking the question of, in my daily life, where's the glory going? Because you don't build something in a day. You don't build a life in a day. It's brick by brick. It's the small decisions, the small motivations. For some of us, maybe like you're on the right path with God. You are building the life that he knows you've been called to do. And you're making God's name known at work or in your community. Like, you feel locked in, and that's a great place to be. That doesn't mean we're exempt from the temptation in Genesis 11, though, because the temptation for those of us in that role are, okay, I know what I'm doing now. I've been doing this for 10, 20 years. I have experience to fall back on. I've got a great team who's got my back. I got this. The temptation is to rely less on the Holy Spirit as you continue to build each day. And maybe for others of us, God's inviting you or prompting you to scatter outside of your comfort zone. Maybe it means the big thing, doing the big thing that is on your heart, like starting the business or changing careers or going back to school or starting a family. But my guess is it's usually in the smaller things. Maybe scattering beyond your comfort zone means inviting that person to church that you know is struggling, that God's been putting on your heart, but you've been afraid to invite them to church. What are they going to think of me? What if the pastor sings something from the Spice Girls? It's going to be so weird. Don't worry, I'm not doing that again. That was just a one-day special. You know, there's a really ripe opportunity just around the corner in a few weeks on Easter Sunday. To that mom who always looks like she's going through it at the school drop-off line. What if you reached out to her? To that person at work that you don't really talk to, but you just notice, man, they're just dejected. What if you reached out? What if the next time you're at Starbucks, you looked up from your phone and started talking to the barista who's there every morning when you are and got to know her story? Maybe it's talking to your neighbor and introducing yourself. Even if you've lived by them for 5 years and you feel like you've passed that point of it was acceptable to introduce yourself in the first 2 weeks, but you didn't do it, and so now you're just like, you're not past the point of no return. Where is God calling you out of your comfort zone to scatter, to move right where he's placed you? There are everyday ways that we get to live out God's command to fill the earth and to share the good news of Jesus. There are everyday opportunities that we have to build a life that points to God's name more than our own. I'm going to invite the worship team up as I close. I was talking to Edgar Sotelo, who did announcements, and then our other friend Manny, who's getting baptized on Easter Sunday. I was talking to them after the first service. We were out on the patio, and they were sharing how this kind of prompted them to reflect. And I said, you guys are two guys that I actually thought of who live this out really well. And I said, it's almost like, Manny's a barber, and in his barbershop, he talks about God, and as he's encountered Jesus, other barbers have started coming to work for him who follow Jesus, and there's been a shift in the culture of his barbershop. And Edgar is a radio host, and he just got picked up here in LA on a station. He talks about purpose in life and how loved people are. And he talks about Jesus in a way that people have to be like, is he talking about Jesus? There's something going on here. And I described it to them as, guys, like it's not us standing there with a Bible preaching down someone's throat. It's almost like when someone passes you on the sidewalk and you can smell their cologne or their perfume, there's like an after thing there. Their name is gone, but there's something there still. That's what we want. That's what a life that's built that points to Jesus' name more than our own. We pass on, but the legacy we leave behind us is the fragrance of Christ. Jesus' final words before he ascends, this is the last thing he says to his followers, is he gives them a recommissioning of Genesis 1:28 to go out and fill the earth. And he gives them the Great Commission to go into every nation, baptizing them in the name of our great Father. What does this mean for you today? Lord Jesus, we need your help to do this, Father. We ask that you show us, God, how to apply this text to our own lives. Interrupt us where our plans need to be interrupted. Confirm us where our plans need to be confirmed. Help us, God, to build lives that point to you and to make your name great.